From the Radio Cafe and Quivira Coalition, you're listening to Down to Earth, the Planet to Plate podcast. I'm your host, Mary Charlotte Domandi. And today we have a special treat for you. We're going to talk to the executive director of Quivira Coalition, Sarah Wentzel-Fisher, who turns out to be quite a Renaissance woman, a farmer, an executive, an artist, all kinds of things. We will hear from her right after these brief announcements. The first of which is I'm happy to welcome our newest Patreon donors, Deborah Bolt and Islam Janina. I hope I've pronounced your name correctly. We thank you both so much. And if you, dear listener, would like to become a Patreon member, you can go to patreon.com/down-to-earth-planet-to-plate. And Patreon is spelled Patreon. And you can support this program for as little as $3 buckaroos a month. And one more thing, registration is opening for the Regenerate Conference on Friday, June 28th. Regenerate will take place November 6th through 8th in Denver, Colorado. This year's conference, Innovating for a Resilient Future, will explore data, technology, information collection, and sharing ways of learning and knowing, and the myriad approaches to fulfilling our ecological roles. Join in this exploration of innovation with leading thinkers and doers. You can find out more at regenerateconference.com. And now to our program. I'm delighted to welcome Sarah Wentzel-Fisher. She is Executive Director of Quivira Coalition, and as many of our listeners know, this podcast is supported by Quivira Coalition. Welcome to Down to Earth.
Thanks for having me, Mary Charlotte. It's funny that we haven't done this already.
I know. We've been doing this for 7 years.
It's amazing. Yeah.
So good. Welcome. And I wanted to, many of our listeners listen to this show to hear about farming, to hear about the food system, about the kind of crazy stuff about hope. This is a podcast about hope. But let's talk about the organization. How do you describe Quivira Coalition to people who haven't heard of it? Give us the sort of introductory statement of what we are.
Sure. So I will often introduce us with our mission statement because that seems like a good place to start, which our mission is building resilience on working lands. And then I usually qualify it by saying, if you don't know what working lands are, those are places where people are gaining their livelihood from taking care of the land. And often that means producing food or fuel or fiber. And we are an education organization that helps support those folks in shifting their practices to ones that are regenerative rather than extractive.
So when you say food, fuel, and fiber, food is self-explanatory. Fiber is things like wool and cotton, I guess. Fuel. What do we mean? We're not talking about oil and gas.
No, we're not talking about, oil and gas is a working land activity.
Yeah.
It's definitely very extractive, just not
right
in our ball court. I'm thinking more about things like forest management and how there's a ton of folks in New Mexico who rely on firewood for heating their homes. Yeah, there's, also folks who are, I think that there's a lot of argument around this, but, there are folks who are growing plants for ethanol as a transitionary alternative to fossil fuels and doing it in a way that is building soil health. I think that that's not a particular group that we're working with, but when I say fuel and I think about working lands, that's another example of why fuel gets included.
Right. I've been looking at old issues of resilience. Well, it's called Resilience now. It used to be called the Quivira Newsletter, and it's actually on the Quivira website, quiviracoalition.org, and you can look at these, and it's kind of fascinating. In the first issue, now keep in mind, this is the late 90s when there were these quote-unquote range wars between environmentalists and ranchers. They were kind of at each other's throats, big battles, no listening, and Quivira Coalition, part of the origin was ranchers and environmentalists started listening to each other. And in the first issue, June 1997, they wrote that the purpose of the Quivira Coalition is to show people that ecologically healthy rangeland and economically healthy ranches can be compatible. And it seems like, there's a lot more going on that the organization is doing now, but that's really still a core principle.
Absolutely. It's still a core principle. And it's interesting to think about that. I love going back and reading those old issues because there's there's so much that continues to be relevant. And I think that the work that we're doing is really long game work.
Yeah.
You know, it's not like we're going to solve whatever our issue is in 5 or 20 years. We're talking about some really deep cultural types of change that potentially take generations to shift. But yeah, I love going back to those original articles. And I do think that idea of ecologically functioning rangeland and economically functioning ranches is still a ton at the heart of what we do. And I think that the argument can be made that it is feasible, it's possible, but the reasons for why there's tension around it maybe not working for everybody has shifted a little bit.
Say more about that.
Well, I think even when the organization started, we were feeling the impacts of climate change, but the ways that we're experiencing them now, I think, is substantively more intense. Right. And so I think that that's one way in which it's changed. I also think that market consolidation has become more intense.
Like the monopolization of so many different parts of the food industry.
Yes, absolutely. Which I think also makes it harder. I think that we continue to have attrition in farming and ranching. So young people aren't willing or able to enter agriculture as a profession. And, you know, we have around 1% of our population engaged in agriculture today, where 100 years ago, it was close to 30% of our population. And so I think that all of those factors contribute to why the dynamic is different today than when the organization started. But I think that there's also a lot of things that are super hopeful about what has changed.
Hang on. I mean, my understanding is, yeah, the average age of farmers is increasing. It's like late 50s right now, or maybe even 60. But there's so many young people who seem to want to go into agriculture, like a new generation of people who don't want to sit in a cubicle or become corporate cogs in that machine.
I do think that there are young people who are really passionate about or are thinking about not wanting to enter into the corporate machine, who want to have meaningful connection to land and to community and to food. I think it's also really hard. Land prices are more expensive than they've ever been. There's also a huge amount of consolidation in land ownership. So land access continues to be a pretty big hurdle for people who want to enter it. And in spite of that, I think people are getting really creative. I think it's when we hit these pinch points that things get really interesting, because invariably people figure out ways to create new systems or work around old systems or break the old systems. And so it sort of feels like we're in a moment of that happening.
Right. What does that look like?
I mean, I think it looks like unusual models of land tenure. I think it looks like different types of markets that folks are creating to be able to sell or trade their products with other people. I'm trying to think of a good example of like what more specifically it looks like.
Well, you know, one thing that comes to mind is people are putting their land in conservation easements so that it can't be developed. And that makes the land, on the one hand, go down in value because it can't be divided into subdivisions. And on the other hand, it keeps it in agriculture and makes that land perhaps more available.
Yes, that's a relatively new tool, conservation easements. And I think that even talking about conservation easements, I think that we're sort of seeing an evolution there, where there was a first iteration that was just like, let's permanently protect this land by removing the development rights from it. But I think that we've also learned that it's like there's so much more that you could do to ensure that it stays in agriculture. There are groups like the Agrarian Trust that are coming up with really interesting models for removing those development rights, but then embedding a community of people who sort of oversee long-term tenure and stewardship of those properties. So that's a really good example of how folks are using old tools to develop newer systems, systems that actually work for folks and sort of, in some ways, bypass, what's happening in real estate.
Yeah. I mean, so-called market forces.
Yeah.
Which, as we've talked about in all sorts of different ways on this program, are not necessarily a free market, because a free market and monopoly capitalism are not the same thing. But anyway, one of the things I wanted to ask you about was New Mexico, in particular, where we are based, has a lot of public land. And I wondered, what is the role of public lands in cultivating regenerative agriculture and healthy grazing and healthy agriculture in general? And how does Quivira, work with public land managers and people who oversee those public lands to do healthy practices on them?
That is a great and slightly complex question, but it's a good one. I think some of our biggest opportunity to really shift, particularly in livestock agriculture, what practices look like when we start talking about public lands. And I don't know that sort of at the federal level, there is quite as much appetite or desire to lean into shifting the way that they think about grazing leases. But I suspect that there will be more energy and attention given to that in particular. And I think that if the BLM or the BLM is actually, interestingly, I think doing some of this work, coming up with really very adaptive management plans with the folks who have grazing leases.
And that impetus comes from the farmers, from the ranchers.
Well, it comes from a couple of different places. I think it comes from the agency trying to meet ecological goals, the rancher trying to meet their needs in terms of their business, but then sort of you put climate change on top of that, and everyone's like, okay, this is we're experiencing this in a really much more intense way. How do we adapt so that we can meet both of those goals?
I think one thing that we should state clearly, especially for somebody who hasn't been listening to this show for so long, or who's new to the ideas of healthy working lands and climate and the interaction of those things, is that when you've got healthy land, the rancher can make more money if you've got healthy water, healthy soil, healthy forage, healthy animals, and so on, healthy insects. Basically, healthy ecosystems are profitable.
Yes, I would say healthy ecosystems are profitable, but also I think that there's another dimension when we're talking about public lands, which is adaptability. The other thing I think that's really critical for ranchers to stay viable is the ability to adapt and to be able to have tools to be able to fluctuate what their herd size is based on what's happening on the land, as well as ways to adapt what's happening with grazing of that land in a way that's responsive to the ecology. It's not like you get the ecology to a place that's functioning and it's like, great, just put the animals out there, everything is peachy keen now. It's like there's a constant dance and interaction between all of those things. And I think that that's where the piece about public lands is both such an opportunity and is a place where there's some stickiness right now, which is just around that adaptivity and having capacity and will within our public agencies to be able to be responsive to the ways that folks want to and see the need as sort of the front line on those landscapes day to day to change things.
But wait a minute. So just let me see if I understand you. Are land managers or agencies basically saying to people who have grazing leases, that's fine, you can use the land, but you have to do it the way we say?
Yeah.
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 And those restrictions are limiting to ranchers who want to maybe do different practices or improve the land in different ways?
Yeah, I think so. And, I'll say it also varies, I think, from, depends on who's in the particular field office
right.
is working with you. There are folks who are creative and are working to be adaptive, but, there are other rules about fencing or water infrastructure or where animals can be or the number of animals that can be there or the time frame that they can be there that are all really more based on a bureaucratic set of guidelines than what the ecology is saying the land needs. And I think that that's where the it gets a little tricky.
I mean, part of the healthy grazing strategy is, I mean, it has a lot of different names, but rotational grazing, holistic land management, adaptive management, and all of those things require bunching animals in smaller pastures and then moving them from one to the next. And you're saying that's harder to do because there's restrictions on fencing and things like that?
Yeah. Yeah. And so, it's like, and there are people who are getting creative, like Glenn Elzinga, who I think has been on this show before, has a lot of public land that he and his team are managing. And, they've figured out this fantastic strategy called in-herding, where they just have people out there shepherding their animals across the landscape. And that's how they get around, the need for more infrastructure.
And sleeping and camping and everything with that. I mean, it's hardcore.
Yeah.
Yeah.
But so, he's, I think, a really good example of how they have figured out how to make both the market and the ecology work. But, I think it probably took years and years of dedication and probably a lot of failed experiments to get all of that to fall into line the way that it has. So,
yeah. Quivira Coalition is definitely using science and doing scientific observation and experimentation on the land. How do you see the role of science in cultivating healthy landscapes and really improving agriculture?
That's also a great and complex question. I think science is super valuable for a number of reasons. One is to be able to have a really rigorous set of data to help inform land management decision making. It's not the only factor. It can never sort of be the only factor. I think that there's also something about science that helps bring the broader public along with what's being talked about. I think Alan Savory is a great example of this, where, he talked about some of these adaptive strategies for grazing and got very shot down by a lot of folks because there wasn't at that time rigorous science to support some of the things that he was saying, even though there were a lot of places where there was evidence on the ground that those techniques were working. And I think now folks like Peter Bick and his team are actually demonstrating that those techniques, intensively managed, rotated herd of livestock on grasslands have a reciprocal relationship and that they actually help each other function.
Peter Bick, ladies and gentlemen, he made a 4-part documentary. We had him on on the show recently, rootsodeep.org. Wonderful documentary.
And I will just plug that it is now available streaming online. Everybody should watch it.
Yes.
It's a fabulous 4-part series. Yeah.
I've seen it twice.
Oh, great.
But yeah, I mean, it's funny because on the one hand, through science, you can discover things you didn't know before. On the other hand, it seems like at least a good chunk of the work is demonstrating things that we already do know.
It is. And that's sort of where the conundrum is. And I think it's a interesting, it's not a debate, but a discussion around traditional ecological knowledge, because the things we already know in some ways are the traditional ecological knowledge.
Yeah.
It is the things that people have known for a very long time who are land stewards. And again, to bring sort of like the greater public along, often we need to have something that says, well, this person in this academy verified that this is actually, based on scientific principles happening.
Right. I mean, sometimes it seems like the equivalent of demonstrating through science that holding your babies and giving them mother's milk is a good thing. Everybody already knew that.
Well, so just, to put a fine point on that, at the farm where I live, we've been working on a project for the Western Sustainable Agriculture and Research Education Fund, which is also known as Western SARE.
Right.
The project was with our Carbon Ranch director, Eva Stricker, to apply compost to rangeland and measure the differences between untreated and treated soil in terms of carbon sequestration. And Zach, the pig farmer there, said, really, we have to do a test to know that putting shit in the field makes it better? Like, we've done this for millennia.
Right, exactly.
But, it's also interesting to understand what are those dynamics. So one of Quivira's values is iterative work and learning. And I think that that's also another place where science comes into play. So it's like we do these tests to have data sets to ask questions, and then invariably more questions arise, and the data can become useful for other questions that we want to answer. So as an example of that, there was an article published recently by a graduate student who I think was working with Dr. Wentzel-Fisher, and she is one of the people who did a lot of the initial research in California around compost application on rangeland for carbon sequestration, which is some of the work that Quivira does now in the Southwest. But her graduate student published a paper that looked at a bunch of that data and, asking a different set of questions, discovered that compost application also extends the growing season of grass by like a week or 2 weeks on either shoulder of the season, which is kind of a big deal. And maybe that's also something that folks knew, but I think that that was a little bit more revelatory and helps create the argument, like, how do we think differently about our carbon cycle and, amend these places through either compost or bale grazing or that type of thing to get the microbial ecosystem functioning again.
Right. And you're pointing to the reality that so much of the work that is to be done is in the soil and bringing soil back to life that has been degraded either through too much chemical application or overgrazing or inappropriate use of tillage and crop cultivation and so on. So you've got this land that's degraded, and bringing the soil back to life is basically bringing an entire landscape back to life.
Yeah, absolutely. Absolutely. And there's one other thing I wanted to say about science, which is I also think that there's something really profound about science that is driven by the questions that people who are managing the land have. And that's a thing that at Quivira we're really committed to, which is like not just asking questions because they're interesting questions, but really thinking about, like, with the limited resources we have to be doing science, where is the most targeted and important work that we can be doing, and what are the questions that we can be asking that actually help get to that place of the functioning ecosystem and the economically functioning ranch.
And so you meet with people who are cultivating land and say, what should we study, basically?
Yeah. It's like, what are the questions that you have?
And what are some of their questions?
Recently, there's a lot of technology happening in this space right now, particularly virtual fencing, which kind of comes back to that question about public lands.
Yeah.
But we had a producer who was like, hey, could you help me develop a proposal to test out some of this virtual fencing in a particular way? And we were able to, just support him in getting some grant funding to do that research. But I just point to that example because I think that there's a lot of folks who have questions about virtual fencing. And so that's an area where it's like we're exploring what kinds of research could we do? What would be feasible? What would people be interested in doing?
Right.
Yeah.
And ladies and gentlemen, if you don't know what virtual fencing is, we are going to do a show one of these days on that topic. But Quivira has a number of initiatives, and one is the Carbon Ranch Initiative, which we've kind of been talking about. So explain a little bit more what that is.
Sure. So I'll try to be succinct, but the Carbon Ranch was sort of a concept that Courtney White, the organization's founder, wrote about. Joan Hallmark, who's an artist here in Santa Fe, drew this beautiful diagram that sort of maps out all of the ways in which we cycle carbon on the landscape. And really, the Carbon Ranch Initiative is asking people to think and behave differently around our carbon cycle. So how that plays out in the work is it's a soil health focused program working primarily with livestock producers. And we are asking this question about, like, what is our whole carbon cycle? So how is our soil sequestering carbon? How can we do more of that? What are all of the carbon emissions that happen in the entire value chain from field to plate to waste? And how can we interact with all parts of that in a slightly different way to be moving towards a carbon positive, climate positive type of production model?
And that is huge because soil, and especially rangeland soil, if done right, has the potential to sequester very large amounts of carbon.
Yeah, absolutely.
So that's the Carbon Ranch Initiative. Another thing that Quivira is doing is the new agrarian program. Talk about that. And what is I was reading again in these old Quivira newsletters, the term the new agrarian comes up, like this is a new way of thinking. What's the new agrarian program?
Sure. So our new agrarian program is a program that is really focused on intergenerational knowledge exchange of regenerative land stewardship and specifically ranching. So the meat of that program is an apprenticeship program.
No pun intended.
No pun intended. The meat of that program is we have any year between 20 and 25 ranches from Montana to New Mexico that we work with, where we train the rancher, not assuming that ranchers are also going to be great teachers, really work with them to understand how to convey the deep knowledge that they have of animal handling and of ecology and of their businesses. And then we pair them with young people who are interested in pursuing careers in agriculture. Those folks go and live and work on those ranches for 8 months. We provide education, some supplemental education to that experience. We provide them a network. We work on helping them find next steps after they've done their apprenticeship, sort of based on where they are in their career path.
Which, as you say, is a big deal because it's not always easy to get access to the land if you are a young farmer and want to farm.
Exactly. And also we're building a community of practice. You know, when there's less than 1% of the population that is doing this, there are people out there, but there are not that many people out there who are doing it, and finding the people who want to do it regeneratively, that pool of people gets even smaller. And so, you know, getting people connected to each other is a really critical part of that program. And then more recently, we're thinking about sort of beyond the apprenticeship. And so working to connect all of our alumni, we have over 100 people who've graduated from that program, getting them connected to one another, getting them connected to educational resources, and also getting them connected to folks who have graduated from our program more recently than they have. So everybody kind of helps everybody out.
Right. And I have to say, I sort of think in terms of plant metaphors naturally, but it just seems like the way we look at ecosystems and all the different players, you know, plants, animals, insects, and then all the underground microorganisms and macroorganisms all play a role. And it's the same with human communities. You know, all these different people play roles. And I feel like part of Quivira's mission and part of what you're doing, and I think you think this way, is really looking at big communities and connecting people in ways where they might have lost connection.
Yeah, absolutely. I could talk about another thing that we're working on, which is our coalitions to enhance working lands.
Yeah.
So we have a group in Colorado and a group in New Mexico, and it really is thinking about sort of the human community as an ecosystem, and, you know, what are all of the different players that need to be connected to one another and have good working relationships to really make land stewardship happen. So back to your original question about public lands, part of the reason that we formed these coalitions to enhance working lands was how do we bring in the Forest Service and NRCS and our Department of Agriculture and the soil water conservation districts and private industry partners all to be having a conversation with each other to really be supporting and uplifting the folks who are doing the most immediate work on the ground, which is the farmers and the ranchers. So they're sort of at the center, but there's this whole ecosystem of other folks who really need to work together well to enable farmers and ranchers to do what they do. So that's what our coalitions to enhance working lands do, is create a space for those folks to connect and talk about what they're working on and hear from other people and ask for help. And it's one of those things that's like, it's like intangible, but it's also so important.
Right. Yeah, it's so hard to measure what happens when people come together. And it's the same with the Regenerate conference that happens every fall in the beginning of November. For those who have not attended a Regenerate conference, it's absolutely fascinating because there are all kinds of people giving presentations and talking about things you never even thought about or knew about, or, regenerative sheep ranching. And I mean, there's so many different things. But then a lot of the action is also like in the hallways and over dinner. That's when you really have those conversations and make those connections that, start to cultivate new ways of doing things or just new possibilities.
Yeah, absolutely. And also it's like the seed of relationships that then grow to be business relationships or a functioning partnership between a rancher and the NRCS office that they work with, or, there are so many things. And I'll just plug the conference really quickly since you're talking about it, because our registration is just about to open. So the conference this year will be in Denver. It'll be November 6th, 7th, and 8th. We'll be at the Stockyard Event Center in the Colorado State University Spur campus, which is a beautiful new facility. And our registration opens June 28th. Yeah, we have lots of support to bring people there if they need support in getting there. But we're very excited. We've got a great lineup of speakers. This year's theme is Innovating for a Resilient Future. And we're going to sort of dive into a lot of the topics that we've been talking about today.
It's a wonderful event. And also on the Quivira website, you can find the speeches from previous Regenerate conferences and check those out. And some of them are just wonderful.
Yeah. There is a link on our website, but we have a YouTube channel. And our YouTube channel has like hundreds of videos. You also can find this podcast on our YouTube channel.
Oh, who knew?
Yes. So you can see past conferences to learn more about what folks talk about at these events.
How did you get into all of this? Do you come from a farming background?
I don't come from a farming background, but I come from the rural West. I grew up in the Black Hills in South Dakota in a really small town where most folks had, anywhere between a toe and up to their noses in agriculture. And then I chose to come to New Mexico to study. So I studied at UNM, both for my undergraduate and graduate work. And I just love living in a really rural place. My graduate studies were in community and regional planning. And I got there. I have a very professional circuitous path. I really thought I was going to go to art school. I have a creative writing undergraduate degree. I did a lot of unmatriculated fine arts classes and was looking at fine art schools for graduate work. And I realized that all of the art projects that I was working on were using creative thinking as a mechanism to bring people together and talk about place and solve problems collectively. And there was a light bulb that went on where I was like, oh, I'm not as interested in art for art's sake. I'm really interested in art for community's sake. And I don't know enough about how community dynamics function. And so I went to the community and regional planning program at UNM, which was amazing and I think is still a really fantastic program. And I studied food systems within the context of community and regional planning. I did my research on economic viability of small farms in the Middle Rio Grande Valley. And that sort of set me on the path to where I am today. And I wore a lot of different hats between that time and now, including being a food writer for Edible Magazine and working with a land trust and working for the National Young Farmers Coalition. But yeah, that's sort of how I wound up where I am now. And I think that so many of those things that informed early ideas and my education really continue to show up and work for me in the work that I'm doing now.
You are not only executive director of Quivira Coalition, but you're also farming.
I am, yes.
Talk about that.
So I live at Polk's Folly Farm, which is a small diversified livestock operation that is in what we call the East Mountains, which is on the east side of the Sandia Mountains, south of Santa Fe and east of Albuquerque. And it's a 40-acre property. I contribute to We have a hog operation, which is a farrow to finish heritage breed hog operation. We raise about 120 pigs, and we raise them for meat, which is sold through a farm stand that's in Cedar Crest, New Mexico, just a couple miles down the road. We also have a herd of goats and a flock of sheep, and the sheep are my project. So I've been contributing to the farm for a number of years, but this is really sort of my first endeavor. So in some ways, I am a beginning farmer. So I have a small flock of churro sheep. And
how do you, like, what's wool or?
So I'm trying to figure that out. I think that the first motivation was to have grazing animals for the pastures that we have at the farm. So the pigs are raised in pens because we have such brittle landscapes. If we put the pigs out on pasture, they root. And so the soil gets disturbed in a way that it takes a really long time to recover. So the pigs are in pens. They're outside and they've got lots of room to run around. We feed them primarily food waste. So we're collecting brewer's grain and produce from Albuquerque. And then the other things that we feed to the pigs, we try to source from as locally as possible. So we do have a grain-based feed that we grind to feed to the pigs, and we're trying to source from farmers within driving distance of us for those grains. But the pigs are in those pens. We use wood mulch coming out of the forest. So as people are doing fire mitigation work, rather than taking all that material to the transfer station and having to pay for it, a lot of the folks who have tree thinning services will bring that wood mulch to our farm. We bed it, we layer it in the pig pens, and then we produce big piles of compost. So the rangeland compost trials that Quivira is doing has really benefited from me being at a farm where we're producing many hundreds, maybe thousands of cubic yards of compost.
Wow. This is kind of amazing.
It's pretty remarkable.
Yeah.
But we have probably 30 acres of grassland that needs to get grazed periodically. And so that was part of the motivation to get the goats and the sheep. So we're trying to learn and figure out how we do that. It's not enough acres to have them out there all of the time. So we are supplementally feeding them. I think sort of a dream would be to be able to graze all of our neighbors. So the East Mountains outside of Albuquerque is an area that has faced a lot of development pressure. There are very limited water resources, the same way that there are in other places in the West. And, how do we shift that? I think part of it is around thinking differently about how we use domestic water resource as well as agricultural water resource. But it's also about regenerating our soil so that our aquifers can recharge more readily. And when you're in a landscape that's been so fractured by development and you have a lot of 2 and 5 acre parcels, thinking about getting grazing animals across those landscapes is pretty challenging. But I think that there's huge opportunity to think about small flocks that could be used in a way where if we're working together as neighborhood associations, for example, we could actually be doing a great job of intensive rotational grazing in those spaces to help make sure that those landscapes are functioning.
So, this is something that your average person who's going to work in an office might find counterintuitive or just puzzling. You put grazing animals on a few acres in eastern Albuquerque, and you've got better water flowing underground.
Yes, I think it is a stretch for people who don't think about it all the time, but it is part of our reality,
Because the soil can hold more water when there is more. Basically, the animals poop and pee and stomp and move the seeds around, and then you've got more plants growing on it, then you've got deeper roots, and those deeper roots aerate the soil, and then you've got more water retention.
Exactly, yeah.
One of the things that I wanted to ask you about that I think is very important, and that is the idea of really cultivating not only regenerative agriculture from one farm to the next, but cultivating regional food systems, because there is something that is really toxic about monopolistic food systems that are really exploitive of farmers, but it's not really feasible for everybody to get all their food from the farmer's market on Saturday morning in Santa Fe. I mean, it's not a complete system. And there's something in between. How do you think about that? What is your vision for medium-sized regional food production systems?
That is a great question. And one of the ways that I have been thinking about it or talking about it is in terms of short value chains. And I think that like regionality is a scale at which that can happen. But this is sort of a little bit of a diversion from your question, but it's also like, how many hands has something passed through before it winds up on your plate or on a restaurant menu?
So on the one hand, if you grow it yourself in your yard and bring it inside, that's one hand.
Exactly.
And if you go to the farmer's market, it's two maybe.
Exactly. And so, for example, at the farm stand where the meat from the farm is sold, the ethos there is short value chains. So there are things that we can't produce here in New Mexico. Maple syrup, for example. But we've got a friend who has a sugar bush in Vermont, and we are able to ask questions or go see what are the practices there. It's like, let's carry that product here. We don't produce it here. So short value chains, I think, is one thing. And I would love for that to be sort of more common vernacular or sort of a understanding amongst an average grocery consumer to be like, oh, what is the value chain of this particular thing that I am buying,
I mean, define value chain.
So value chain is the, steps from field to plate.
Okay.
And the places where value is created along the way. And, other people use the term supply chain.
Right.
One of my previous jobs was working with La Montanita Co-op, and that was a place where I learned the vocabulary value chain, because it's like, how do we create food systems that add value every step of the way?
And so a long value chain would be a grain is grown and then it's shipped somewhere else to be processed, and then sugar is added, and then you get some junk food 4 steps later.
Yeah, or 7 steps later.
Yeah.
Yeah. But I also, so back to your original question about regional value chains, I think that this is a thing that has been, the conversation has been happening for a long time around the need for ag in the middle. And it is a thing that has been evaporating since probably the early 80s. Ag
in the middle meaning somewhere between farmers markets and corporate monopolies.
Exactly. Yep. Between, direct, very small scale boutique direct retail and corporate monopolies. It's like, where is that infrastructure for agriculture that is mid-scale, that is serving a bioregion? And, I think that there's something really beautiful to think about mapping these different bioregions that overlap and using that ethos of short value chains. And it's like, what can we grow here that Southern Arizona can't grow, that we could have a good robust trade for citrus to come to New Mexico? And and then it's, it comes down to economics also, in terms of like, where does the money flow? In addition to where does the food come from, where does the money go? And when we've got regional value chains, the money is staying here.
Exactly. Now, does this infrastructure exist? Is it something that people are trying to cultivate on a policy level or on a cooperative level?
I mean, the infrastructure doesn't exist. And we don't actually sort of talk about it in our mission, but I think it's pretty deeply embedded in the work that we do at Quivira. So, for example, in our Carbon Ranch initiative, we have a project right now called Soil to Supper. And it's funded through a U.S. Department of Agriculture Climate Smart Commodities grant. It's a 5-year project. And in this project, what we're trying to do is create much shorter value chains for livestock producers. And we're not tackling all of the particular obstacles that they have, but we're trying to create a community of practice, which, means a group of producers who are all talking to each other about regenerative land practices and engaging in regional supply chains with the meat that they're producing as a way to get a price premium for what they're producing and to get the money that, they're generating back into their communities, as well as carbon back into the soil, because those two things are related to one another.
Right. I mean, I think anything that involves spreading the wealth within a community and making sure that farmers get the value of their work and the value of their excellent production is something that we really need to be thinking about, because like it or not, when we spend our money at supermarkets and buy corporate products, we're sending that money out of our areas, and so little of it is going back to the farmer, wherever he or she may be.
Yeah, absolutely.
In the time that I've been doing this podcast, which we started in 2017, and I was covering Quivira conferences on the radio in the years before that, the term regeneration and the phrase regenerative agriculture has really come more into common parlance. Like if in 2014 I'd said regenerative agriculture, most people would look at you blankly, and now a lot of people are kind of excited when you talk about that. How do you see the effect of these concepts trickling down into society?
I think, I don't know if I can say how. I can say where.
Yeah.
And it is like, it's exciting to me to like talk to my niece from Brooklyn, New York, who is thoroughly aware of all of these concepts and, is interested in agriculture and is interested in soil science.
Is she a school kid?
No, she's 22
okay.
now, but, has been intrigued by this for a number of years and is excited to talk about those concepts with friends and neighbors. So I do think that it is much more on folks' minds. I mean, I also think that it's interesting that these concepts are like Hollywood is starting to talk about these concepts. The group Kiss the Ground produced that film and has recently produced a second film that really sort of talks about all the different systems that inform how agriculture is currently practiced and how we could be doing it much differently.
The second one being called Common Ground.
Common Ground, yes, thanks. So, I think that those are some of the ways that it's showing up. I also think that it's showing up in policy, which is another place that is super, super important for it to be showing up. And, I think how it's gotten there is by farmers demanding it, as well as, sort of to bring it back to the beginning of our conversation, environmental groups demanding it. And so it's interesting that is another point of meeting in the middle for folks.
Which is how the Quivira Coalition started in the first place.
Exactly, yeah.
How is the Biden administration doing in terms of recognizing the need for regenerative agriculture?
Good in some ways and could be better in other ways. I think on the one hand, we are a recipient of a Climate Smart Commodities grant. Climate Smart Commodities is sort of coded language for regenerative agriculture.
Okay.
And it's interesting that it has that name rather than just being called regenerative agriculture. But I think somehow maybe Climate Smart Commodities seems more palatable to a broader audience. Regenerative agriculture as a term may never show up in policy, but I think that there are a ton of things that are happening with the current administration and with the farm bill that they've been trying to pass for 2 years now, who knows whether or not they will ever get it passed, are really sort of embedding that into funding streams and the sort of thinking and mandate that's being sent to the agencies within USDA. And, I think in some ways the Biden administration is doing some really great heavy lifting there. And then in other ways, I think that they could be leaning in a lot more. And policy, I'll just say policy is tricky. Another hat that I wear is I'm on the board of the Rocky Mountain Farmers Union, which is a farm policy organization. So that's where I get a lot of exposure, because the Quivira Coalition doesn't do a lot of policy work.
Right.
We understand policy work and how it affects us, but we don't do a lot of that work.
What is the Rocky Mountain Farmers Union all about? What's it doing?
So the Rocky Mountain Farmers Union is a chapter of the National Farmers Union, and the National Farmers Union is one of the largest farm organizations in the country and is a really powerful voice at Congress. I think we're the second largest general farm organization in the country. We have tens of thousands of members all over the country, and the Rocky Mountain Farmers Union is a 3-state union. It's Wyoming, Colorado, and New Mexico, and we have about 20,000 members. And we get together and we talk about policy that informs agriculture in our 3 states, and we write a policy manual, and then we, as farmers, go to our state legislatures and we go to Congress and we bring our issues to our elected representatives.
And they listen.
Yeah.
Well, Sarah, I want to thank you so much for being with us on Down to Earth. I learned a lot from talking to you today, and I think our listeners have as well. And I just want to say you are just a terrific leader. It's good to work in an organization that has a strong and responsive leadership. So thank you for everything that you do, and thanks for being on the show.
Thanks for your podcast, Mary Charlotte, and thanks for having me on. It's been really fun to be here and talk with you.
You've been listening to Down to Earth. We would love it if you would support this program, which you can do by going to patreon.com/down-to-earth planet to plate, where you can sign up for as little as $3. Patreon is Patreon. And also please rate and review the podcast on Apple Podcasts or wherever you get your podcasts. The Quivira Coalition is a not-for-profit and a community network of ranchers, farmers, conservationists, scientists, educators, and many others dedicated to regenerative practices that produce healthy food, support meaningful livelihoods, sustain biodiversity, and remedy the impacts of climate change. To learn more about Quivira and how you can support their work, visit quiviracoalition.org, Quivira. And finally, this show is a production with the Radio Cafe. You can check out radiocafe.org to hear back episodes of this show and also find all kinds of other shows on a wide variety of topics as well. Thanks for listening, and we'll see you next time.